Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. We're working with the GUI elements that we developed in the previous set of VMKs, and we're incorporating them into our game engine so that we can have some logical flow from one state to another before the user starts playing the game. You've seen this diagram already. When the game starts, we start up over here and there's a splash screen that we see, and then we go into a game state menu. This is where we were working in the previous VMK to set up the linkages between the menu and the loading state, the menu and the option state, and the menu and the quit. Now what we're going to do is go into game state options and set up all the different options that the user is going to have in here to tweak the game before it gets loaded. We already have this linkage here backwards so that we can go from the option state back into the main menu. Before we go into the code, which will have all the new GUI elements loaded into this option state, let me show you what I've done inside of the GUI.tga file. I've added in a couple extra controls from what you've seen here before. I've had some gray text now. This will show up inside of the options menu. And I've also added these square boxes here, which we'll use as checkboxes. Believe it or not, we already have a GUI control that will handle a checkbox for us. As a matter of fact, it's a regular button. Depending on which state the button is in, we can put an X inside of this checkbox or not and handle the color coding as well. It's similar to the radio buttons, but with a checkbox you can have multiple checkboxes checked at the same time, whereas a radio button you can only have one in the one grouping. I also added this little leaf image here, which we'll use just as a visual element that's set up in the GUI. I wanted to show you how to use regular images inside of the GUI so that you can tweak or fancy up your GUI elements without having to create a new GUI image class. You can reuse the pre-existing button class to render this image on the screen, and this is basically like a static button. It doesn't matter whether you're highlighting over it, you're pressing on it, it's just going to render the one image. So the GUI button class is actually very versatile. You can actually use it for many different things, and that's why it's the very first GUI element that we created in the series. Anyway, let's go into our code now and take a look at what we can do with the options menu. We're going to need to go inside of the scenes class's initialize function and first load in all of our GUI elements. So just down here we have the options menu display items, and we've already added the back button, so let's add in all the other things as well. Okay, there's quite a few items in here, so hopefully we can follow along together. We're going to have our image, which is going to just display this gray text right here, display options. And I position it at a certain spot. And because it's a pure image, I set up the texture here to use all four states to be the exact same color. And because of that, no matter what highlighting or pressing you do on the button, it's not going to react visually in any way. It's always going to render the same texture. Next thing, we have some text here, which is going to be resolution. So we display that onto the screen. We have the leaf. There's going to be a number of these leaves that show up, and they're just used to space out the text from the actual controls. So we have that over here. Then we have three different resolutions that the user is going to be able to choose. We have 800 by 600. So we set that up, and this guy is a radio button. So we go into here, and we first need to assign the textures for this radio button, and after we do that, we take that button and put it inside of the radio group. After we do that, we can then go and create the other two buttons, the 1024 by 768 button, assign those textures and add it into the radio group. And then finally we also add 1280 by 1024, assign the textures and add it into the radio group. We then need to specify which of these three options is going to be the default. So we're going to, by default, set up to be 800 by 600 initially. A little bit later on, we're going to do a little bit more work over here, but for now, just leave it as it is. We need to indicate to the user which of these radio buttons are which option, because right now, all they're going to see are the circles on the screen. So I created text labels that I place beside each of these radio buttons. So here's one that says 800 by 600. There's another one here that says 1024 by 768, and finally 1280 by 1024. Next thing that the user will be able to change is the viewing depth. Inside OpenGL, if you go back way back to the very beginning, you'll see that when we set up our perspective matrix, one of the parameters in there, or actually two of the parameters in there, is the minimum viewing depth and maximum viewing depth. These two parameters are going to be sort of very important to us depending on what kind of game you're trying to make. The minimum depth is pretty much fixed always, but the far distance that the user can see in the game, we should make that adjustable, because if the game is running on a system that doesn't have a very good video card, you may want to decrease the viewing depth to increase the rate at which the game can run at. If you have a really large viewing depth, the game engine will have to work a little bit harder because it calculates more items per frame because it can see more on the screen. So this viewing depth is really sort of a tweaking control that the user can play around with to optimize how many frames per second they can get on their screen. Next, we have another leaf showing up, and then we assign a texture to that leaf and attach it to our game state options. Next, we have a text label that is going to show us on the slider bar which side of the slider is the near side and which side is the far side. So we're going to have a little small text that says near and another set of text that says far. Finally, we have the slider bar, which is used to slide between the near side and the far side so the user can indicate how much of the screen can the players see while they're playing the game. So we've set up the slider bar here, and the range that it's going to go between is 500 to 2000, and by default it's going to be set up to be 1000. Next thing we have is some more text here, and this is for the image quality. We'll remember that when we load the images into our game engine, we have 4 quality options. So here we can specify which quality option the user wants. We have the first thing here is a text label that says that this slider is going to be image quality, and then we have a leaf, and then we have our 4 quality settings. So if we scroll across here, we can see we have, by default, it's going to be set up to be quality factor 4. The minimum is 1, the maximum is 4, and we do have a discrete step size of 1, so you can't set up a quality factor of 2.5. It can only be either 2 or 3, but not 2.5. Next thing we have here is we need some quality labels as well, similar to the near and far, so that on the slider the user knows which side is the high quality side and which side is the low quality. So we have quality low, which is just going to show low here in text, and then we also have high showing up here in text as well. Then in the bottom half of the screen, of the option screen, we're going to have some menu control items. So we're going to show up another image here, and this image is going to be this guy here, control options. And let's go back into our code. So we show that on the screen, and then we have whether we want to invert our mouse or not. So we're going to have a checkbox here for this, and we're going to label the checkbox first to say invert mouse Y, and then we're going to create another button, which is going to be our leaf. And finally, we're going to have the button, which will be the actual checkbox itself. So here we have button mouse invert, and down here we assign the 4 different texture states, and these texture states pertain to these checkboxes over here. Finally, we need to set up the state that we want this checkbox to be in. So we're going to take it and make it true, and then we add that to our listing of controls. We're almost done. We have mouse sensitivity we can play with as well. So we are going to label a text item here, mouse sensitivity. And then we're going to have another leaf showing up. And then finally we're going to have a slider. And again, with the slider, we need to indicate which side is the low side, which side is the high side. So I'm going to have a text label here for low, text label here for high, and then we have our slider. And the slider is going to go between 0.001 up to 0.003. And you can change these values however you like. It really depends on how you like the mouse to work. And by default, I'm going to set up this value over here. And if we scroll down, that's it. So quite a few controls, quite a few things on the screen that we're going to have to worry about. Oh, we have a problem here. All right, we need to load in some font that we can use whenever we're displaying all this stuff onto the screen. So to do that, we're going to have to go back up to the very top of this initialize function and make sure we load in the text, or sorry, load in the fonts before we load in all the GUI elements. The order that we load in these GUI controls is important because a little bit later on, I think in the next VMK, I'll show you why all of these items have to be loaded in this specific order. But for now, just sort of follow along and make sure that everything is loaded before you use the GUIs first, and then once you have your GUI elements, group them all right after you load in your GUI.tga file. Okay, so we have our text here, which is called UI small ID, and let's add in here UI fancy ID. And it's going to load in our font image from fancy.tga, which I've placed inside of the resources fonts directory. Okay, let's try and compile this now. Okay, he's okay, so let's build it and run it and make sure that all of our controls are showing up properly. So inside of the options menu, this is what you should see. We have display options, and we can change the resolution, change the viewing depth, and change the image quality. So with the resolution, we have the 3 controls here we can specify. With the viewing depth, we can go from near to far. And for image quality, we have it currently set to high, but we can move it down to image quality 2, image quality 3, image quality 2, and image quality 1. Inverting the mouse, we have a checkbox here that we can turn on and off. By default, I like to have my mouse inverted, so I'm going to make it to be true. And then finally, we have our mouse sensitivity, which we can change from low to high. By default, it's stuck here in the middle. After we're done, we just hit back. Now, there's a fundamental problem that we currently have. We've placed all these GUI elements on the screen, but we actually haven't integrated them into our game engine. We can change all these values we like, but by changing them, we're not updating anything currently in the game engine. Remember that with all these buttons, initially, when we had them showing up on the screen, we could click them and they wouldn't do anything because we needed to handle the cases of what actually happens when these buttons get pressed. So we still need to write that code. But visually, everything for the game state options screen is now up on the screen here. So let's just quit out of this. Now, to make the linkages between the GUI controls and the actual elements within our game engine so that the GUI controls actually do something, we'll need to go into our scenes GUI check hotspots. This is where we went in to make all these buttons behave appropriately. So we're going to be adding in new switch statements here to handle the case where we're going to be working with the GUI slider or any of the other buttons that are going to be pressed upon. Now, the way that this is currently laid out, there isn't a nice way to pass information from this function, GUI check hotspots, into all the different locations where these GUI controls have to affect. So, because of that, what I'm going to do is use the puser settings class to handle all the variables that the GUI can change. So, the user settings class is going to, in essence, hold the user's desired settings for everything. Then, anytime we need to say, okay, I'm loading in an image, what is the texture quality format should be, I'll then just use the user settings class to get that value. Now, this is going to be a little bit of work, so I'm going to finish off this VMK here and come back for the next VMK where I'm going to show you how to update this user settings class to handle all of this data transfer from the GUI items into all of these different locations inside of the game engine.